Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for following today's event, which is organized by 𝐬𝐴MEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, and the Institute of Global Affairs of the American College of Greece. Our discussion today is a very hot topic. It concerns Eastern Mediterranean, an area that is currently, I think, Europe's hottest place, as gas and geopolitics are threatening to inflame old rivalries. Our topic today is very optimistic. It is the Eastern Mediterranean is not doomed to instability. So we will try to find out how we can manage the various challenges in the region in order for this exactly to happen. So I would first like to ask Mr. Panayotis Tsakonas, who is professor at the University of Athens and the head of security program at 𝐬𝐴MEP, to make a small introduction to our topic first.
Thank you, Nektaria, and let me start by thanking each and every one of our speakers of this online conference for responding positively to our invitation. The webinar follows the postponement due to the pandemic of the first Global Politics Summer Academy, which would take place in Athens, organized jointly by the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy and the American College of Greece. And at the title of the summer school, at the time organizing the event, there was a big question mark. The title at the time was, "Is the Eastern Mediterranean doomed to conflict or instability?" As you may have noticed, and as Nektaria mentioned, for today's conference, the title has turned into a kind of an affirmative statement. Namely, the Eastern Mediterranean is not doomed to instability. And this would in turn mean that you are about to embark on, I would say, rather demanding enterprise, and based on your expertise and experience, provide us with your insights and different perspectives, not simply on the current security landscape of the Mediterranean, but most importantly on reasons enough to hope that there are indeed prospects for cooperation and stability in the region. And this is apparently a kind of a Herculean task, I would say, given that for a number of reasons, the Eastern Mediterranean has become one of the most turbulent areas of the planet, or according to many analysts, a laboratory of instability. So along with the apologies for the Herculean task you're assigned, our sincere thanks for on behalf of 𝐬𝐴MEP for your participation. And we are looking forward to a very interesting and very enlightening.
Thank you very much. I will now ask Mr. Haris Vlavianos, who is Professor of History and Director at the Institute of Global Affairs at the American College of Greece, for his introductory remarks as well.
Thank you, Nektaria. Well, as Taki said, can you see me?
No, at the moment we can't. But we can hear you. Or no, we can hear you now. I would like to tell everyone that is watching us that you can send us our questions, because we have a panel discussion that will start right after Mr. Vlavianos' introductory comments. And you can send us your questions via Facebook or YouTube, or you can send us via email at events@𝐬𝐴MEP.gr.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Sorry. I was saying that, as Taki said, this is the first collaboration between the Institute of Global Affairs, the American College of Greece, and 𝐬𝐴MEP. We were planning a summer academy, which of course was canceled. So we're very glad that we can do this discussion today under the circumstances. and the plans and strategies of all these countries that are very antagonistic. In other words, the question, I think, of today's meeting is how can stability be maintained, created and maintained? So I'm looking forward to a very interesting and demanding discussion. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much. We have a very, very interesting panel with us today to discuss this issue. We have Fulvio Attina, who is professor at the University of Catania. We have Berger, who is the head of the EU delegation to Turkey. Daniela Huber, who is the head of the Mediterranean and Middle East program at Instituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Günter Seufert, who is the head of the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. And we ask everyone, I can see that the questions are already coming. You can send us our questions live in Facebook or in YouTube, as I mentioned, and also via email at events@𝐸AMEP.gr. So I would like first to ask with a question to Mr. Attina. I would like to ask you if you see if something has changed drastically during the last year in Eastern Mediterranean. EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said recently that Russia and Turkey changed their balances in Eastern Mediterranean, changed the balances in the region. And China, we can see, has also a very strong naval presence, and not only. It has a presence in the ports of Haifa and in Piraeus. So what do you think about the balance of powers, the power game in the region?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you to the Institute of Global Affairs. And well, let me explain what I mean by that. For sure, you pointed to the game between Russia and the United States with the intervention of China. Absolutely so. This is the world problem of today, following a continuous delegitimation of the world order of the past. For sure, the United States and Russia have been joined by China. And the three great powers have in the Mediterranean completely different behaviors, completely different stance towards the problem in the Mediterranean, towards their own reason for getting engaged in the Mediterranean. Well, let's start with the United States. The United States declared their disengagement from Europe, from the Mediterranean. As a matter of fact, nobody believes in a total disengagement of the United States. They are there ready to intervene, or this has been the case with intervention in Syria for contrasting the ISIS. This is certainly the case when there are problems for Israel, for other allies of the United States, like Saudi Arabia. So the United States are there, but they are not the main, let's say, aggressive great power in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. Russia, the question is, Russia always present, I mean, in time of the Soviet Union, and then diminished its presence, is back again. Is back again, why? One explanation is given by the problem of oil, of energy, the cost, the price of energy, which is very important to Russia. So Russia influenced the Eastern Mediterranean for this reason. The question is only for this reason, or there are other geopolitical interest objectives by Russia. There are some signs that Russia is interested in this, because moved the naval forces from the Black Sea to Eastern Mediterranean. But for the moment, there is no clear, strong objectives that Russia want to defend, want to be present, but there are no important goals at stake to Russia. And lastly, China. Of course, the first reason to understand China presence is the economic or trade commercial one, because Russia is a leading economic player in the world market, and therefore is interested to approach Europe through also the Eastern Mediterranean. As a matter of fact, is Eastern Mediterranean, the whole Europe has been included in the Belt and Road initiatives. As you remind, there are many or some important ports, port facilities that attracted the Chinese capital investment. Is this the only reason? Here again, there could be something more, because China everywhere in the world is also playing the political and security card. That's to say, is very much involved in peacekeeping organized by the United Nations. So want to be also a security player, not only a trade or a commercial player. And the side that want to play this card also in the Eastern Mediterranean, or in the very proximity of the Eastern Mediterranean, is the fact that not recently, but now 2 years or 3 years, Bill has created a naval base in Djibouti, which is on the door of the Eastern Mediterranean. So for sure, this presence of the great powers must be clear, carefully watched, monitored. Is not at the moment the main reason of the instability, which is probably we will discuss later, in the end of the countries in the area. The great powers are playing their new game, because it's a triangular game we didn't know in the past. But also, maybe I will add more later, they have not yet a clear strategy of their future movements their future cards in this game. So let's wait and see for the moment.
Mm-hmm. I will now, thank you very much, Mr. Attinà. I will now go to Mr. Berger, and I would like to ask you about the West's role, the EU and the US role in the region. We can see in Syria that the Astana group, Turkey, Russia, and Iran is playing a key role. And in Libya, we see Turkey, Russia, and Egypt being dominant players. So what is the West's role in the region? And since you are the person on the ground, I would like to ask you if the issues of Eastern Mediterranean are important for the Turkish society, because here in Greece, it is they are dominating in the agenda every day. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be with you, and congratulations on this first cooperation between 𝐸𝐴MEP and the American College. Really looking forward to see more of this, and I'm very, very glad to be with you this afternoon. You mentioned a number of important aspects, including the Astana process. Simply to say that the latest Astana meeting has just ended. So the three leaders just had a video conference, and I'll come to this maybe in a minute. But before starting, let me start with maybe recalling a few facts that I am sure are very well known. First of all, that the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Mediterranean in particular, is of very great importance to Europe and the European Union. And not only, it is also a shared neighborhood between member states of the European Union and the other European countries of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a shared geography. I mean, these are all slogans that you're all very much familiar with: shared geography, shared history, but also sharing a number of risks and challenges that are the same wherever you stand, on which side of the Mediterranean you stand. So you have terrorism, you have migration, you have radicalization, you have the refugee crisis as such, the migratory flows, as I mentioned. So here, the European member states and the other countries are obviously partners also in dealing with these aspects of the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have even institutions. We set up institutions that are dealing with this. I remember when I joined the European institutions in the mid-90s, we were just about setting up the Euro-Mediterranean dialogue, which then became the Barcelona process, and now we have the Union for the Mediterranean. So we even have infrastructure. I mean, we have structures that are supposed to deal with many of these issues that you were describing early on. And that's quite important. So it's not only it's dealing with the priorities. It's dealing with finding solutions to many of these issues that I've just mentioned that are challenges to the European Union. You mentioned Syria. You mentioned Libya. I would even add to it the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the Eastern Mediterranean, which are, I think, important issues for the European Union. Now, we often are not perceived as a military power or somebody that marches in and tries to sort out issues and problems. We are coming in with different means and different modalities. So very often we are trying to find a way of engaging, a way of bringing people to the table. So the convening power of the European Union is something that is, in my view, quite important and very often underestimated and not valued enough. And we also very often share with our partners the need for finding a political and negotiated political solution rather than an enforced solution that very often doesn't hold and falls apart very quickly. So just to come back to the Astana meeting today, this was one of the messages from the three presidents, that we need to find a political solution in support of the United Nations and what the special representative of the Secretary General is doing in Syria. So this was reinforced. This is certainly very much in line also what the European Union wants to do. On Syria, if I want to continue, I can tell you we had yesterday, we had the 4th Syria conference in Brussels that brought together countries like Jordan, Lebanon, but also Turkey with the United Nations and member states of the European Union to talk about the situation. in Syria and see what the EU can do in support of finding a negotiated, peaceful solution, to a political solution to the conflict in Syria, sort of finding an inclusive peace, in addition, of course, to the humanitarian aspect and the support that we have to give to the Syrians. Similar, I think, is the situation in Libya, where yes, we were ready in the early days of the after the Arab Spring and the situation in Libya to come with a border management mission, but at the same time also support assistance to the Libyan government to provide health, education, and other type of support to the population. That is still continuing, and this is what we are still doing on the ground, in addition to working with the United Nations to find a negotiated and solution together with others who are represented, for example, in the Berlin conference. Now, you mentioned Turkey in this context, so let me maybe say a few words on that as well, given that I'm at the moment in Ankara. I mean, Turkey, just looking at the map, is obviously an important power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Turkey is trying to assert itself in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I think it shouldn't go unmentioned that also the European Union has certain views and positions on the Eastern Mediterranean, and the same way the EU has to be adamant in pursuing its own policies and its own what we think it is right and should be done. And here again, it is an issue when you, for example, when you talk at the when you look at the maritime boundary delimitation between the continental shelves and the exclusive economic zones. Our point of view is this has to be done on the basis of international law. This has to be done on the basis of European Union acquis, and has to be done either through negotiations or through arbitration or by going to an international judiciary body. So, I mean, these are very strong points. I think also the High Representative brought across when he visited both Greece and Cyprus last week to reinforce this, and I'm sure it will come up in the forthcoming meeting of the European foreign ministers on the 13th of July. So these are very strong messages from the European Union that we have kept repeating in the last year or so. So the European Union is often belittled as an organization or as a body that provides humanitarian assistance or funds. But we should not underestimate the impact of what we are doing here in providing stability. And I think that is the point that you are making in this panel discussion, the importance of maintaining stability or re-establishing stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. Let me come back to the point that I briefly mentioned about the Middle East conflict. I mean, we have always, our involvement there from the beginning was to provide stability, to make sure that the Palestinian Authority can build its structure. I mean, simply as an example here, to provide assistance to the UN organizations that deal with the refugees in the Eastern Mediterranean. So these are, I think, very important contributions by the European Union, by the West in general, which is not necessarily now, sending in aircraft carriers or other military equipment, but working with these tools in the same direction, in the direction of providing security and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. In addition to what I mentioned early on in fostering and supporting political talks and maintaining humanitarian assistance to people in need. The second part of your question was about how does the Turkish society see the Eastern Mediterranean. I think it's very similar than what you've just mentioned about Greece. It is a topic that is in the papers. It's a topic that is also very much supported across, I think, the political spectrum in the country and across the population. So this is an issue, again, given the size of the country, given the coastline of the country, that resonates with the population, and obviously is a political issue domestically, but also a political issue when it comes in the relationship between Turkey and its immediate neighbors. It leads also, and it factors into a much broader discussion between the European Union and Turkey, namely the accession process or Turkey's status as a candidate country for membership in the European Union. Here, there's one important aspect that we all keep repeating, the people who are working here, but also the High Representative, I think, repeated last week. And that is the very important aspect of good neighbor relationship. So when you want to join the European Union, you need to sort out your troubles and your political problems with your immediate neighbors. So we, at the moment, unfortunately, we see a downturn in this aspect. Turkey, I think, managed to sort out a number of issues with other member states of the European Union. When I came here in 2016, it was a very bad relationship with several countries in the European Union. Some of those countries have now, I think, a more stable and straightforward relationship. But with Greece and with Cyprus in the last, I think, period, in the last 6 months or a year, it has gone worse. And Turkey has also rejected calls by the European Union, by the Foreign Affairs Council, by the European Council, in addressing these issues on the basis of dialogue or engagement, and to reestablish peace and stability in the regions. But again, I think what is important here is that we continue talking, we continue engaging. I think this was the purpose also of the trip of the High Representative to both countries last week, and this will continue now, I'm sure, after the meeting of the foreign ministers. So I would be more optimistic in your overall theme, and I would think European Union can pay a contribution to re-establishing stability in the region. But of course, we need to keep in mind what our positions are, and we need to make them very clear also to any of our partners in the region. So thank you I hope this has briefly answered your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Berger. I will now move to Daniela Huber, and I would like to ask you something about Italy. We have seen that Italy distanced itself from Eastern Mediterranean and held a rather discreet, I would say, stance regarding the MOU signed recently last November between Turkey and Libya. And last year it avoided clashing with Turkey when Turkish vessels harassed any ships off Cyprus. So do you think that it's rather pro-Turkish or neutral stance is helping Italy to play a mediating role in Libya or the Eastern Mediterranean? And does Italy want to play this role?
Thank you so much, Nektaria. Thanks a lot also from my part to 𝐸𝐴 and American College of Greece. Well, regarding Italy, I would probably say that Italy doesn't have a pro-Turkish stance. Rather, it seems to me that traditionally Italy has a very non-confrontational approach to foreign policy. And I think in the current situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, that is actually quite an appropriate approach, because let's remember the picture we find ourselves in here. So there is the conflicts in Syria, in Israel-Palestine, and in Libya, and they have been left fostering for quite a while. Unfortunately, I also have to add, I think, by the European Union, which could have been much more forceful towards all these conflicts. Forceful not in terms of any type of military means, but forceful in terms of diplomatic means. And so what has happened is that these conflicts are now all increasingly interlinked. Yeah, so Syria and Libya, for example, is very tightly interlinked. And these conflicts are also tied up with the rather grave regional fault lines, which are on the one hand Turkey and Qatar, then there is the Arab revisionist states, so the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, who are also in an alliance of Israel, and there is the third, let's say, alliance by Iran and Hezbollah and the Assad regime. And I think in such a complicated and explosive situation, the EU and its member states must not spill more oil into the fire. So indeed, it would be great if Italy can actually mediate here on issues of immediate concern to de-escalate the situation. But I also think that we need to go a bit beyond mediation in our imagination for security of the whole Mediterranean. And Mr. Berger mentioned the Barcelona process. Indeed, almost ironically, I think this year we are celebrating 25 years anniversary of the EU-Mediterranean partnership. But if we look at the Eastern Mediterranean, we could not be further away from the spirit of this partnership. And I think that what needs to be done on a part of the European Union is to think about a new approach, a new vision, which is more adapted what is actually happening right now. And so this is about security and energy governments, of course, which needs to be really inclusive of all actors who are relevant in this game. Now, is there the will in the EU to pursue something like this is another question. And I would like to turn also inwards to the EU to look a little bit at Italy's stance. In the EU, I think that Italy's approach is actually largely in line with what quite a big part of EU countries and EU institutions think. For example, it has been reported that German Chancellor Merkel has been quite upset with the recent single-handed French foreign policy in the region, which has undermined a shared European position, most notably in Libya. And such European disunity then obviously leads to the ability of other actors to move in, may it be Russia or also Turkey. And now that Germany takes over the EU presidency, I think there might actually be an opening, or I hope there is an opening for Italy to advocate under this umbrella for a shared European position on Libya, but also the Eastern Mediterranean. Probably Günter has more on this from the view from Berlin. Finally, I would like to turn to what are the positions here to bridge within the EU. And if we look at Italy and France maybe as two poles, I think we have to understand the different lenses with which Italy and France look at the Mediterranean at large. I think Italy's approach is mainly influenced by the issue of migration, which is of course an area where Italy and other member states have pursued rather problematic policies in Libya, but also the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, in contrast to Italy, France has a very strong security lens on the Mediterranean, but also beyond, of course, with its military involvement in the Sahel. And with this lens, France has in the last years become very close to this axis of revisionist Arab states, which has actually clamped down very harshly on the uprisings in the region. So if you look as an example at French arms trade to Egypt, this has tripled since the coup and the Rabaa massacre in 2013 to 1 billion euros last year. And I'm raising these two issues, so migration on the one hand and security and the arms flows, not only because it explains dissenting Italian and French positions, but also because I think when we speak about security in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Mediterranean at large, then we also need to speak about the human security of the people who are living and moving in this space. So that's the human security lens. And any kind of security governance which Europe eventually and hopefully elaborates on this region also needs to address these issues. And I want to close maybe by connecting briefly to what Mr. Berger said about the EU not being a military power, but a soft power. I think there's two important points to be aware of. One is that the EU is not a military power, but European member states have a massive arms trade actually with the region, and there is a European instrument on this, which is the common position on the arms trade. And I think this is something that needs to come into this discussion too. And the other issue is indeed a European soft power. And this applies particularly, I think, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been mentioned. The European Union has been rather reserved, I think, lately, waiting all the time for the US to come out with a position on the conflict, rather than coming out with its own position on it. And it in a way, it seems as if the European Union is forgetting its own soft power that it has. Because if we remember back in the 1980s with the Venice Declaration, this set the stage for the US to eventually buy into the European position 10 years later. And it was a very courageous declaration. And I think the European Union has this same kind of soft power towards Israel-Palestine, but also, I mean, in some ways in Syria, to at least insist on some parameters, given that the European donor role, anyways, is very important for the Russians, for example. So I think it can set some parameters. So I close with that and wait for the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, moving to Mr. Seufert, I would like to ask you, what are the key issues characterizing the post-pandemic security landscape in the Eastern Mediterranean? Do you see any changes after the turbulence of the last months? And what are the key strategies adopted by the state actors and by the international organizations for managing the various security challenges in the region? And do you think indeed that what we say in our topic is accurate? Do you think that stability is possible to achieve at this point?
Yeah, thank you also from my side for organizing this event. As both Mr. Attinà and Mr. Berger and Mrs. Huber already talked about strategies and perspectives and aims of different powers in the region, I would like to underline maybe one or two, maybe three longer developments, because I think we are dealing here with a number of structural problems, and we should think about really more long-term or at least midterm strategies and positionings. The first, I would say that the title, and it was already mentioned, of the webinar is very highly optimistic, and maybe it's a wishful thinking. And because I think I see two areas, or one is in the wider region, or even on a global scale. I think what we see today in the Eastern Mediterranean are, for one hand, the outcomes, the undesired outcomes of the Arab Spring, namely the destruction of states, the deeply deadly polarized societies in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the south of the Mediterranean, between more or less masses ready to be addressed by Islamist theories at the one hand side, on the other hand side, either secularist dictatorships or very authoritarian monarchists that legitimize themselves with a religion, and that reproduce Islamist thought and Islamist dynamics also in the future. On the other hand, we have, with the end of the Cold War, we have the decline of the formerly Western-dominated regional order, and we have, I think, also a serious decoupling of US security policy and European security policy. And we have this kind of decoupling also between one of the major actors in the region, between Turkey and the US. Today we see that in the Turkish discourse, the US is perceived as one of the major, if not the major, threat to Turkish national security due to its support for Kurdish forces in Syria. And the Turkish government definitely sees or perceives the US also as inimical to its rule. When we remind us of all these discussions about who is behind the coup and who is still residing in Pennsylvania. And at the same time, we see also as a long-term development, we see naturally a deep crisis of the European Union that has lost, to a large extent, its transformative power it once disposed. And we see this particularly in the case of Turkey. The ambassador naturally talked about if somebody wants to join the European Union, it has to stick to particular norms and values. But we see today, at least at my perspective, that Turkey has nothing to lose anymore in Europe, because I think the membership perspective is, if we want it or not, it's dead, because it's dead due to the political climate and development on a domestic level in Turkey. It's dead with the new identity Turkey has achieved itself as a regional power that positions itself more and more in confrontation with Europe. But it's also dead due to the lacking capability of Europe to integrate a country as Turkey. I always fought for the membership of Turkey, but if you are honest, we see that the European Union today has extremely difficult even to grant a perspective for the small Western Balkan states, and therefore to expect Turkey to align any of its policy for becoming a member to the European Union is totally out of discussion. And therefore, I think we have to think about what can we create for Turkey that it can lose in Europe, because membership is blocked, the customs union negotiations are blocked, the visa free travel negotiations are blocked, and why should Turkey in any regard take the positions of the European Union into account? naturally, with the decline of the Western-dominated political order, regional order, we see new actors now in the Mediterranean, and we see an assertive Turkey, and we see naturally Russia. And even if these are more short-term developments, but as COVID was mentioned, I think that Turkey, naturally, all of the states in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Europe will be weakened by COVID. But I think that Turkey will be less weakened than its adversaries. As its adversaries in Syria and Libya, Russia, where we have a decline of the industrial production, and we have this dramatic fall of the energy prices. And this is true for other adversaries of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And it's true in a particular degree also for major European countries, particularly the countries close to the Mediterranean, France, Italy, Spain, which have a huge economic setback. That we see that even in the smaller, the mid-term developments, the position of Turkey, I think, will not be weakened. I think this is one of the first point I wanted to make. And I think already Turkey is a kind of a global power, because due to its own strengths, military and economically, but also due to its sitting in a very fragile region, and that is of high significance for Europe and for the West, and due to its capability to play major powers against each other. And I think Turkey, Europe and the European member states have to grasp this really in all its depths, and to develop a long-term strategy how to deal with Turkey. Because Turkey, I think at the same time, fundamentally questions the status quo in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is questioning the arrangement, the post-World War arrangements in the Aegean, with claims on Greek islands. It is in a way questioning the international law of the sea, because its positions are not aligned to the international law of the sea. And it is questioning until now, the renunciation of military force. And therefore, and we see, in my view, that this is a long-term shift in Turkish policy. We see, I think, since 2015, gradual but steady militarization of Turkish policy. This militarization of Turkish policy we see due in concrete actions, be it in the incursions in Syria, where Turkey is now in a way occupying, holding, how you want to mention it, a territory that is almost 3 times the size of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Turkey has bases in Iraq. Turkey has a new doctrine of forward defense that draws the frontier lines, where the homeland is protected from northern Iraq to Libya, to Somalia. And we see that Turkey is taking this really serious. And with the concept of the blue homeland, we see that with this concept of the blue homeland, if we take this concept seriously, Turkey is claiming sovereignty on parts of the Aegean Sea and of the Mediterranean Sea that are legally not territorial waters, but exclusive economic zones of European member states. And therefore, I think we have to think on different levels. One, on the level of soft power. How can we again create some leverage on Turkey? What can we present to Turkey to be ready to negotiations? And on the other hand, we also have to think about priorities, I think, of European policy towards Turkey, because as the ambassador has said, we had a lot of quarrels with Turkey in Germany on diaspora issues, on migration. We have a very engaged society here in Germany due to this long history of migration from Turkey that is very much dealing with Turkish domestic policy, with human rights, with the treatment of the Kurds, and what else. But I think now we are at a new stage. So quarrels of Germany and other member states, be it Austria, for example, with Turkey had been on migration, on diaspora, on human rights, on the Kurdish issue. But now the quarrel of Turkey with France is of a complete different nation. It's a quarrel on the geopolitical interests, on long-term geopolitical and economic interests. And it's a quarrel where both sides, in a way, are playing with the use of military force. And therefore, I think we are on a new stage of our relations with Turkey, and really need to sit and to think how to approach this new strong revisionist and expansionist power.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Mr. Seufert. I would like to remind to everyone who is following us that you can send your questions via Facebook or YouTube or via email at events@𝐸AMEP.gr. First of all, I would like to, because this is the main issue in the Greek agenda, I would like to have a follow-up question to everyone, whoever wants can comment. Turkey said, as you know, that it will go ahead with drilling in what Greece considers its exclusive economic zone in September. And the EU has repeatedly indeed called Turkey to respect Greece's and Cyprus' sovereignty. Yet, as Turkish officials recently said, and the Turkish ambassador here in Athens, for example, said that very recently, Ankara says what it does, what it plans to do, and does what it says. So are you afraid that a conflict might be imminent? And what could we expect from the EU or from the Western powers? Would you like to start, Mr. Attinà, or whoever wants to comment?
Yes, well, this is a very tough question, hard to answer. Well, I maybe say that it's not the first time Turkey and Greece or countries in the Eastern Mediterranean face one another with and ask questions. When I say this, I think that the two countries and also other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean are used to take for long in their confrontation regarding also territorial issues or border issues. So your question was the position by Greece and the position of Turkey today are very rigid. Does it mean that they are going to crash to a conflict? I don't think so. I don't think so because after all, this question is quite recent, or is very recent, and they did not, for the moment, or the Eastern Mediterranean country as a whole, have not divided into fronts, one supporting Greece, the other supporting Turkey. And almost all the countries in Eastern Mediterranean are concerned with border delimitation and, of course, in the discovery of gas field has strengthened this concern. So there is a pressure by all the countries to not go too fast in this confrontation. This is my view. So I think they will, Greece and Turkey, record to their traditional commitment to negotiation, although it's a harsh negotiation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Berger, would you like to comment on that? Sorry, we can't hear you.
Here we are. Sorry. No, sure. I'm happy to comment on this. I think the point that the European Union has been making all along, ever since the first sort of questions about drilling started in the in the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus was very clear that the European Union stands behind the sovereign rights of our member states. We have been time and again accused that we are being taken hostage by member states, and then we have to reply that, you know, Greece and Cyprus are the European Union. It's not that these are different entities. So we are a union, and the member states have shown very clear solidarity with both countries. But it doesn't mean that we can't engage with Turkey and bring this point across. So now the point that Mr. Seufert made is a very important one, namely, what is our leverage both in a negative or in a positive sense? We have, and he very rightly pointed out, we have hardly any leverage left. So negotiations on the customs union are not happening. Visa liberalization is not happening. Accession process is not happening. The pre-accession funding to Turkey has been radically reduced to a very small amount of money. So what is our leverage really? I mean, one leverage that remains is that I think Turkey wants to be part of Europe, and whenever you listen to speeches by a Turkish politician, this comes up at the very top. So I think this is a very important aspect. And again, it leads into the question of good neighborly relationships. So if you want to be part of Europe, then you need to have a good relationship with the European countries. So that's one. That's a political, I mean, maybe a little bit of an abstract concept, but it is still, I think, an important political aspect in this debate. And the second one is, despite of what we have just heard about Turkey's actually good performance post-COVID, it's still the economy. The strongest link between the European Union and Turkey is the economy. Turkey is the fifth, I think, largest economic partner of the European Union. The EU is the biggest economic partner of Turkey. More than 50% of its foreign exports rate goes to the European Union. More than 60-70% of foreign direct investment comes from the European Union. So this is a very strong bridge, which I think we should use to reinforce the importance of a good relationship between the European Union and Turkey, which includes obviously concerns of our member states. And I give you a very practical example. When COVID started and countries started to close their borders, we had to make sure that the trade flows between Turkey and the European Union would continue. So Turkey was invited to take part in this green lane concept between us and our partner countries, or within the European Union, to make sure that this trade flow continues. So I think it was a very important aspect of that relationship. The next thing that is happening right now, which is in my view also a very important aspect in that relationship, is to see how strategic production lines can be brought closer to Europe, and that either inside the customs union, meaning European Union plus Turkey, or European Union or Turkey. As you all know, Turkey is a very strong part of the European supply and production chain in industrial goods. I mean, other goods not, but in industrial goods. So this is, I think, an important aspect. So if you want to have a good relationship, if you want to do this, if you want to relocate business into Turkey, you need to have a good relationship with the European Union. So I don't think we are completely without leverage, also in a positive sense, but we need to use this, I think, in a straightforward and also an intelligent way.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Huber, would you like to add something to this?
But I think the most important points have already been made. I think what is just important in this case is that the member states are actually rather united. There is a rather united European strong position on this, as opposed to, for example, Libya. And that is an important point for the European Union to have some leverage. And also, I really like what Günter said. In fact, how can we gain some leverage? And I was thinking this further, what this actually means for Greece, because for Greece, the period when Turkey was getting closer to the EU was a period where conflict was relatively contained, I think. And so, so actually thinking from the perspective of Greece, it would be important to repair this in a way and to think how to gain this leverage again. That's it from me.
Thank you. Mr. Seufert, what do you think? I mean, Germany is usually considered as a country that wants to have very good relationships with Turkey because of the migration mainly. What do you think is at stake here in September? Are you afraid that the situation might flare up?
I am afraid. because as you said, Turkey is doing what it is announcing. I fully agree. Germany has very strong links with Turkey, and these strong links sometimes lead also to strong quarrels. But the German political community and the government is very, very interesting in upholding workable relations with Turkey, not only due to migration and to refugees, but also Turkey is already a large, an important partner in the German value chain, and therefore there is a kind of interdependency between Turkey and Germany. When it comes to what is to be done or what could be done, it's always easy to make proposals, but much more difficult to realize them. But in conscious of that, I would say at three levels. I think the European Union and maybe also Greece should act or should come forward. One is, we know that when it comes to the delimitation of maritime zones, as far as I'm not an expert in the international law of the sea, but to my knowledge, one of the main quarreling points, discussion point, is the status of islands and the question how much they depose on a continental shelf. And we see in this question, both Greece and Turkey, they put forward maximalist positions. The Turks say there is no continental shelf island at all, and Greece, to my knowledge, says every small island, if it is inhabited, has the same right as large territories. And the way the truth and the meaningful, and I think there is room for a meaningful compromise. And I could imagine, for example, that the European Union, which disposes of a lot of experts on the international law of the sea and on the application of the international law of the sea in very different regions around the world, could come forward with some proposals for a meaningful compromise, not to treat Greece in the same way, Crete in the same way as Capodoriso. And therefore, I think that would be one way where we say we may open a channel of communication and of negotiations with Turkey. Another channel, but closely related, linked to this, is naturally the question how the Turkish Cypriots could be, in a way, more have a say, not in the gas issue. Given the fact that the gas issue is losing significance rapidly due to the decline in the energy prices. Another point, I think, for European Union, and the ambassador rightly pointed out that it's only the economic relations where Turkey is still interested in cooperation with the European Union. I think we are at the moment, as a European position, but also the position of the German government, is linking the question of renegotiation of the customs union to criteria that come out of the membership process, namely the fallback or the setback in the terms of rule of law and human rights. So this is a criteria on the membership process. At the same time, we see that we have to realize, I think, that the European Union is not able to democratize Turkey, but the European Union is challenged by Turkey's geopolitical activities. And therefore, I would strongly argue of a decoupling of our economic interests and our geopolitical interests from the criteria of the membership process, and signal to Turkey that Europe, that the EU is ready to renegotiate the customs union, because this is in the economic interest of both partners, more of Turkey than of the European Union. There are studies who point this out and link geopolitical concerns to the question of renegotiation of the customs union. And we have started a small project here in Berlin where we are going to discuss this in more detail. A third level, and then I think, and it's so obvious, I think Europe needs a common position towards Turkey in much more questions. We don't have, and this is a story of the past, I think we didn't have really we had formally a common position on membership, but we had different policies. And now we have, for example, no common position when it comes to arms exports, when it comes to the question of the customs unit, when it comes to visa issues. And Europe must really work on common positions, because we are heard in Ankara only when we are speaking with one voice. And I think a combination of these three levels could again create something of at least a potential leverage on Turkey, and would enhance the chance that the European Union and European interests would be taken into account in Ankara.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up, because you mentioned that the significance of hydrocarbons and everything is not as important as it was before. Do you think that it is basically used, these things, the discoveries are used a bit like an excuse by the powers in the region to draw their borders? Or do you think it's still significant for the economy? I mean, do you think that the East Med will actually happen at some point, for example?
I think may I? Yeah. No, I think in the long term, we know that it will need a couple of years for the energy prices to recover. And we have the green turn in Europe. We have declining European capacity and European consumption. And therefore, I think, and we know that the exploitation of gas in the Mediterranean is relatively expensive. And therefore, I see a big lack, or the possibility of a big lack of interest in these resources, particularly in the side, on the side of the Western powers. It means for American, Italian, French energy companies, because these companies are in a way working with an eye on the European market or on international market. But the situation is different for Turkey, because Turkey has a huge energy market, a huge consumption, and therefore for Turkey these resources are still relevant, disregarding, not totally disregarding, but relatively decoupled from the price development. And therefore Turkey, I think, has both a strategic interest and a continuing economic interest in the resources of the Mediterranean.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I have a question from the audience for Mr. Berger. The question is the European law and the international law armed with sufficient legislation so that there are the necessary consequences for the states that do not follow the regulations? And at which point can we say that there is a serious conflict between the EU and the third country? Should EU re-estimate the past provisions on trade and border security?
Well, first of all, the European Union is certainly interested in upholding international law and upholding international multilateral structures like the United Nations when it comes to the political aspects, but also we have a lot of issues on trade where we have problems, and we have seen this not only in relationship with Turkey lately, but also in relationship with other big powers around the globe where trade laws are being violated. So, I mean, yes, we have a strong interest in upholding international law and enforcing international law, but that brings me to this point of enforcing international law. How do you want to do this? There are sometimes judgments by the International Court of Justice or by similar courts that are dealing with these issues, including the International Maritime Court. But it's really, in the end, it's not only a legal issue; it's also a political issue. How you want to really enforce this, and what are your means, and what and you can. And I come back to this question from early on. What is the leverage to make sure? One, I think, important leverage that we always have in international relations is if you want to use the word reciprocity. That means we follow rules and regulations, and you follow rules and regulations. And if we don't, then there is a breakdown in the relationship. So I think that's an important aspect, and we see this now in trade relations. Yes, we have the customs union, and yes, there are ideas of modernizing the customs union, but we also see a lot of problems with the existing customs union, where we see sort of chipping away on the principles of this customs union, and this of course came to the forefront also with COVID. But we are talking to our partners and try to make sure how can we go back to the rules. With the forthcoming customs union, or with the plan for upgrading the customs union, we also have foreseen that we will have a dispute settlement mechanism, which we don't have at the moment. So at the moment, when we have a problem, we have to go to WTO. But in this case, if in case we were to negotiate the modernization of the customs union, we would add a dispute settlement mechanism. So again, I think everything that is in favor of upholding international law, enforcing international law, we are very much for it. But the question is, how can you then, but this is a general point, it's not only a point in relationship with Turkey, this is a general point in today's global policies. How can we make sure that international law is being applied? So, and by the way, I would like to mention this. We see Turkey here actually as an ally of the European Union. Turkey has an interest in upholding international or multilateral institutions, multilateral principles and processes that have actually helped both the European Union and Turkey in recent years. So this is something we really need to work with Turkey and encourage Turkey to work with us closer in upholding international law. But of course, there are particular interests, and Turkey is adamant in following certain paths and is very assertive on certain issues. So I think that needs to be factored in as well. But I think by and large, there is basis of talking to Turkey on that issue.
Thank you very much. If anybody wants to add something, oh yeah, please go ahead, Mr. Attinà.
I would like to say some words about this theme of the relationship between the European Union and Turkey. What has been said, I think, is true, is important, but I call on not overestimate the importance of this relationship on the foreign policy of Turkey. Because it's absolutely true that there is a leverage in trade relationship between European Union and Turkey. But I remind that after all, this leverage did not work on the problem of refugees and migration, because we had to pay more to Turkey. Turkey did remind that we are the most important partner in the import and export of Turkey. But also, I think Turkey is exploiting the present political conditions, the present change in world politics, in Middle East affairs. Therefore, Europe is not the only card that Turkey has on to change, to act. I think that, as has been said, well, I think it's too much to say that Turkey is a global power, but for sure is well exploiting all the political opportunities that Turkey has for gaining an important position in the local, regional, and in global politics. So, of course, the European Union has to find again its transformative power, but we cannot forget that Turkey has not this card, the European card, as its own only expectation or aspiration for the moment.
Thank you very much. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Seufert.
No, a very short comment to what Professor Attinà said. I think naturally it's true Turkey has alternatives, but we know that the trade balance of Turkey with China is catastrophic for the country, and the same is true for the trade balance with Russia. And we know that it's particularly the European market that in a way demands and consumes more developed, technically developed material and products from Turkey. And we know that the customs union had a tremendous effect on the enhancing of Turkey's productivity. When Turkey, despite all this, and despite the fact that more than 50% of the investment in last years came from Europe, and that Europe has regained in a way its also its status as the primary export destination. When, despite all this, Turkey is able to behave in the way it behaves, I think it's not due to only relative importance of the economic relationship. I think it's due to the fact that the European Union is not acting, because the European Union is not acting in a positive way, that it, for example, is able to agree on renegotiations of the customs union, but it's also not able to act in any form of in a negative way, that is sanctioning in any way. We don't have a policy, an active policy towards Turkey. We are stacking ourselves or binding our hands to no policy. We're saying no negotiations of the customs union, no visa liberalization, no membership. And therefore we are imprisoning ourselves in a non-policy. And therefore Turkey has no reason to take the Europeans into account. I think this is a problem, not the failing or the missing significance of the economic leverage.
Thank you very much. Does anybody want to add something to that? Okay. Apart from the EU's policy or non-policy, I would like to ask you, how much interest do you think that the US has in the region? Because we have seen a very active role in the last 2 years, 2017, 2018, maybe early 2019. We have seen that the US was focusing a lot. Wes Mitchell, who was their person here, said that they are competing the other powers, namely Russia, China, for positive influence in the region. But we now see that the US priorities, I think, have changed. And now the priority is to limit their role and actually get closer to Turkey. We have seen a report by CNN that says Trump and Erdogan were talking like twice a day. But apart from Trump, we also see that the US diplomacy in the region has changed. I don't know if you agree with this analysis. What do you see the US role in the region at the moment being? Yeah, please go ahead, Ms. Huber.
Thank you. Well, I think that it is very clear that the administration has begun, I mean, just already the Obama administration began to disengage from the Middle East, but it has still a few particular goals in the Middle East. And in that respect, I think that the current Trump administration, for example, is creating some facts for US foreign policy, which then also a following non-Trump administration won't be able to divert from very easily. And I think what are fixed priorities right now are mainly maximum pressure against Iran on one hand, and maximum support for Israel on the other hand, even to a point that the US itself is breaking international law. And the other interests of the US seem to shift around very much all the time. And I really think it has become a bit futile for us Europeans to wait for the US and then react. This is what we have done since the 1990s. And Stephen Walt wrote a great article about this, that the Europeans don't even know what to do because they were used to just drive on the American train. But we are not in that US hegemonic moment in the region anymore. And this is why I think it's so important that the EU proactively begins to think by itself what its vision for the whole region, for its relations with its neighbors can be. And maybe one other little point to add, if the EU is able to set up any type of security governance initiative for the Eastern Mediterranean, I think that this can actually set the stage for the US to buy eventually into such a European position, because they clearly don't want to invest in this right now. But the European Union has an interest to invest in this, and the US would eventually buy into it, I think.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to comment on that?
Yes. I think it's very hard to foresee what the United States will do in Eastern Mediterranean, for the reason that the disengagement from Europe and the Mediterranean was coupled with the so-called pivot on Asia, so engagement in Asia. This condition is still true. It is maybe reinforced because the United States has to pay more attention to what China is doing. So I think United States, Trump or not Trump, is sincere when they say you have Europeans to invest more, give more of your resources in the area, because the United States are having important commitment in Asia. And this also makes the situation more difficult because, as has been said, the United States still have important interest in the Mediterranean, but abstaining from being continuously present, when they come back, they do something that we have not anticipated, that we maybe a new position that we were unprepared to react. So I think Europe has to learn how to deal with this behavior of the United States, this policy, that to say they stay a little behind, but are always ready to come back according to their interests.
Thank you very much. I have two different questions for Mr. Seufert that show that our audience takes what you said before in a relatively opposite way. The first question is, Mr. Seufert, why are you playing down the Turkish aggression against Greece and the EU? And the other question is, do you think that the EU as a federation has been able to unite trade in reality, or does its state act on its own interest by creating monopolistic relations?
I have difficulties with both questions. The second I didn't understand, and I would ask you to repeat. The first one, I think I didn't have downplayed the aggression. I did not use that word, but I said that Turkey questions the fundamentals of the status quo in the Mediterranean, both in regard to the international law and in regard to the order established after World War I in the Aegean, and when it comes to the readiness and to use force. And these are all new developments for the Mediterranean, and therefore I think I don't have downplayed any aggression. And the second question, I'm sorry,
I will repeat it. The second question is if you think that the EU as a federation has been able to unite trade in reality, or its state of the EU acts on its own interests, basically.
That's a very different question, because I'm dealing with Turkey, and not so much with the EU. I think.
I'm sorry.
Wait a minute. I got the question now, but it's really tricky, because I think we see both. We see naturally. We see when but Mr. Berger is much more in the position to answer this. But to my knowledge, we see naturally that Turkey, as the EU, is in a way framing, coordinating, and also in a way regulating trade, particular trade inside the EU with the common market, and naturally trade with third powers, As an example, the customs union or the free trade agreements the EU is conducting with other third countries, but this does not take away the mechanisms of the private capitalist economic system we are all living in, and where naturally states with economic structures may profit more and on the expense of states with less developed and weaker economic structures. This is a fact I'm not going to renounce.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Does anybody else want to answer the question about trade in the EU? Mr. Berger, sure, please go ahead. Thanks.
No, I think Mr. Seufert is absolutely right. You have on the one hand, you have the European Union has actually, this is one of the areas where the European Union has full competency. So trade is a European Union competency and no longer the member state competency. So the European Union sets up the regulatory framework. The European Union, on behalf of the member states, negotiates trade agreements with third party. That would negotiate, for example, now the upgrading of the customs union with Turkey. Yes, the union needs a mandate from the member states to do this, but then it's the union, in this case the Commission, that would negotiate with Turkey the upgrading. But this doesn't take away the commercial relationship between Turkey and individual member states. Either promoting certain, trade aspects, certain industries. We see this now with tourism, for example, that Turkey has a very strong interest in re-attracting tourism to the country. So they engage on an individual basis with members. For example, tomorrow the Turkish foreign minister is in Berlin to talk with his counterparts about tourism. So I mean, there are both components. Where I think the European Union gives the regulatory framework, but then of course member states come, and you see this also now in the beginnings of trade talks between Turkey and the United Kingdom. They need to arrange their future trade relationship as well, but that will depend also on the UK's future trade relationship with the European Union, because we need to have first an FTA with the UK before Turkey then, as part of the customs union, can agree with the UK on a free trade arrangement. If you allow me, I would like to come back to the previous point on what Mr. Seufert said about or what he sort of indicated as a lack of strategy on the European Union side when it comes to Turkey. I wouldn't say there's a lack of strategy, but there is a total disagreement on tactics. Mm-hmm. So the strategy is, in my view, to keep Turkey as close as possible. I mean, the word that you always find in literature is to anchor Turkey as close as possible with the European Union, both politically, economically, but also from a security point of view. The way of doing this, I think we're not very clear on. Is it through membership, as it was proposed in 1999 to the candidate stature? Is it something else? You have heard other European politicians who came up with the idea of strategic partnership, which of course is a red cloth here in Turkey, because this is seen as a downgrading of this relationship. If you want to sort of summarize this strategy, I think you can look at what 𝐻𝐸𝐿 Juncker said in his farewell speech at the European Parliament when he talked about Turkey. He said it's the European Union interest to see a democratic Turkey, a prosperous Turkey, and a stable Turkey as an immediate neighbor of the European Union. I think that is the strategy. How to achieve this, what tactics we apply, I think that's really the debate.
Thank you very much. And one last comment, one last question from me. Someone has mentioned before the need for maritime border deals to be done in the region. And Greece and Italy recently signed a maritime borders deal, the first one that Greece signs. And Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu welcomed the agreement and said, we're willing to also have this discussion with Greece. Do you think that this signing could affect or accelerate more agreements like this in the region? And do you really think that at this point that the relationships we see that they are at their lowest point probably in more than a decade since the EMEA crisis, I think, could actually start negotiations at this point, the two countries? And maybe your closing remarks as well about that. Would you like to start, Mr. Attinà, a comment on that?
Well, I am not an expert neither in international law nor in energy, but I think it's common sense that if you have a resource, you have to create also the environment for exploiting these resources. What I mean, that the border disputes are negative, are counterproductive on the exploitations of the gas fields. So sooner or later, I think negotiation on this issue will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Huber?
Yes, I mean, I also think this is actually an interesting approach, you know, a gradual incremental approach to security like this. But I think, as I said before, there needs to be a larger approach to security accompanying this. It's not enough, I think. And as we are going to close, I really wanted to highlight again the issue of migration and how important this is for the security of everyone in the Eastern Mediterranean. The point has already been highlighted that the European Union has become blackmailable by Turkey on the issue of migration. Also, I had a Horizon project which I was coordinating where we did 700 interviews in Turkey and the whole Mediterranean. And the most harmful issue for the position of the European Union in the Mediterranean is its migration policy. So its soft power is incredibly harmed by migration. And I think it's particularly for my generation and for our children's generation, it's important that the European Union begins to solve this issue within migration governance within the European Union itself, but also with our neighbors in a way that is in the confines of international law and not outside of it. So that's my last point that I wanted to make.
Thank you. Yeah, in Greece here, there is indeed high hopes that basically the German presidency will find some sort of agreement on this issue that you mentioned. Mr. Berger?
Thank you. Let me continue with this point. I fully agree. Migration has been an issue that has been troubling the European Union for quite some time now. I mean, there is, as you know, the Commission has been proposing a number of initiatives that have been rejected by some of the member states. And I think the Commission will propose again something that will try to harmonize better asylum procedures, but also the rights of migrants and refugees in the EU. What we do at the border, how can we make sure that the asylum procedures are done in an efficient manner, in a quick manner. So there are many aspects that the European Commission is working on, and I'm sure hopefully will put on the table very soon. And I think you're right, the German presidency will be extremely useful, helpful, and an important factor there. The other points I wanted to mention, coming back to the overall theme of this discussion that we have just had about stability in the Eastern Mediterranean, I cannot agree with anyone who said that this is very important to the European Union. Indeed, it is. I can also only agree with all of those who said among you that the European Union should be playing a much stronger role in this area, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is not only migration, this is also energy. I think it was mentioned, this is security in general. After all, this is our immediate neighborhood. So yes, I followed with interest the debate you had on the United States. Fine, this is maybe of their interest too, but I think it should be even of bigger interest to the European Union. To play a more active and proactive role in the Eastern Mediterranean to solve many of the problems that affect us and not only affect the immediate neighbors or the states along the Mediterranean, but even further beyond, particularly when it comes about migration, further beyond and deeper in the European Union. So I fully agree with those who have said there should be a stronger role to be played by the EU.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Seufert?
Very shortly, I think it was a great step for the agreement between Italy and Greece, and I think in a way, at least as far as I read it, it's underlining the strength of the Greek position that islands dispose of a continental shelf, at the example of Greece and of Crete, and therefore I'm happy to hear that Mr. 𝐻𝐨𝐻𝐿 was happy with this agreement. I hope that Greece is able to conduct further agreements with Egypt or with Israel. This is the only way forward to in a way to force everybody into agreements that are in alignment with the international law of the sea.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank everyone for this very interesting discussion and everybody who followed us. And hopefully we will be able to have another panel soon and also in person. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Γεια σας.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.